motivations and things that are going on that are not as great as you would hope.
Yeah, or I mean, you could make the case that not only are they not all that better than you are,
maybe they're actually significantly worse. Yeah,
I mean, I would encourage a couple of things. There's a phrase that sometimes you'll hear in kind of like congressional Capitol Hill settings, sometimes with people that work in that environment, where the way they kind of explain House of Cards is the worst 5 minutes of your day, and West Wing is the best 5 minutes of your day, and then everything else kind of falls in between that.
Or maybe the rest isn't actually good television.
Yeah, that's probably a good way to put it. The rest isn't necessarily the greatest television. But also, I think after the first or second season, there was a article that came out. I can't remember for the life of me where. I'd have to look it up. But it was talking about kind of the current U.S. cultural obsession with post-apocalyptic television.
Interesting. Okay.
Whether you're talking about something like Jericho on CBS, 10 or 12 years ago, is actually a pretty good show. Or going all the way back to like the late 90s and looking at something like Buffy or, Earth 2, all the way now to things like Walking Dead and The Strain and things like that.
Yep.
Part of the case that it was trying to make was specifically about House of Cards, that House of Cards is also a post-apocalyptic show as well. But what's occurred is a moral apocalypse, where
That's interesting.
There really isn't necessarily in that world. There isn't necessarily, the moral structure that you would expect that might be in place to prevent people from doing the kind of things that happen on that show. And so when you're talking a little bit earlier about it being a window into possibilities and a kind of a cautionary tale, I wouldn't disagree with that from the standpoint of you're dealing with a cautionary tale of this is what the aftermath of a moral apocalypse, a kind of moral breakdown, very well could look like.
Well, that's all very depressing. Why don't we kind of like pull it back and talk about something a little bit cheerier for just a minute before we kind of go back into darker territory with Winter Soldier. Here's a fun thing. I saw, and honestly I can't remember at this point where I even found it. It was shared by somebody I know in Estonia. In the Soviet Union. Do you know the Soviet Union made movies, Aaron?
I didn't know that, but I wouldn't be entirely surprised.
They made honest-to-goodness movies because they're a big, country, just like, empire or conglomerate or whatever you would have called them. But Russia makes a lot of movies. They have their own, major film industry, and even in the Soviet Union, they were making movies. Of course, a lot of them were full of Soviet propaganda, but
sure.
In 1985, the Soviet Union produced an adaptation of which classic work of fantasy fiction, Aaron? Guess.
I have no idea.
A very, very, very classic work of fantasy fiction.
I'm afraid it might actually be Lord of the Rings.
You're very close.
Huh. Well, then maybe the same world, but maybe The Hobbit?
That's correct. Yep.
Wow.
There's a Soviet adaptation of The Hobbit, and it is available in its entirety on YouTube to watch. It is 1 hour and 11 minutes long. It has full English subtitles, and I sort of skipped through a little bit of it before we started the podcast, and it is hilarious.
Wow.
It is well worth your time. If you think about if you think about the WonderWorks production of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe stories, or the Chronicles of Narnia stories that they did, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Prince Caspian,
the BBC,
and,
right?
Voyage of the Dawn Treader and the Silver Chair. You'll have a pretty good approximation of the production values of this little feature, and it's hilarious. It's well worth your time as a geek to look that up. We'll drop a link for that in the show notes for today. But it's very, very entertaining.
I'm trying to, juxtapose that not only with, having read the book 3 or 4 times in my life, but also the Peter Jackson films. Like, what in the world am I in for?
Yeah, well, you're in for a little bit of a treat. I think it's pretty entertaining. The dialogue, from what I saw, hews pretty close to the original dialogue from the novel. It's actually interspersed with scenes of like a narrator like sitting in a leather armchair and like talking about some of the scenes. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. It's worth a look.
All right, I'm gonna have to look that up this week.
Yep. Yeah. So,
wow.
There we go. So there's some fun stuff. Let's go ahead and dive into Winter Soldier.
Yep, let's do it.
All right. So I took some notes here, and I'm gonna just pull those up so that I can know what I want to talk about and remember all of these beats that I wanted to hit. So I really, like, having just gone back over these really recently, man, the Captain America films are so great.
They really are.
I think as a taken as a group of films that are focused on a particular character, I think I would want to say that they're the strongest individual hero focused films of the MCU.
I would agree with that. I mean, like you said, taken as a unit, there really isn't a misstep in the 3 films. I mean, even if you were to look at Captain America: The First Avenger and kind of think that it's a little bit cheesy and maybe a little bit subpar. I don't think that, because
I
Joe
don't
Johnston,
think so either.
The director, is the guy that gave us The Rocketeer.
Yeah.
And so he's already that particular individual. I mean, not only are we dealing with the fact that it's Joe Johnston, this is the guy that started out in the, art department for Star Wars and special effects and all that, and he's the guy that gave us Boba Fett. I mean,
I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Yeah, he's the guy that kind of gave us Boba Fett and designed, did the designs for Boba Fett for Empire, and so he got to start working with Lucas on Star Wars, and then went on to do things like The Rocketeer and one of the Jurassic Park movies, and he's actually going to be directing the new adaptation of Silver Chair.
That is super cool. See, that makes me very excited for that, because I know that the fellow who wrote the script for that was the writer of Life of Pi.
Okay.
And I haven't actually seen that movie, but I've heard only good things about it. I know that it was up for a bunch of Oscars that year, and I think it actually won Best Picture.
Okay, that's interesting. I'd be willing to check that out, knowing that he's writing Silver Chair. But Joe Johnston's is in the director's chair for the 4th Narnia film, and this guy, he brought a lot of his 40s era sensibility that you see come through in The Rocketeer. He brought that to bear on Captain America: The First Avenger, and if you've seen both films, you kind of seen that see that shine through.
Well, and there's a certain earnestness to both of them, isn't there?
Yes, there is, because of the time that they are a product of, in terms of the time that they're trying to
capture,
and typify and to show you. You know, juxtapose, say, The Rocketeer with the other period piece that came out around that time, you know, Alec Baldwin's The Shadow.
Oh, that is an interesting comparison to make, because The Shadow is a far more, I don't want to say pessimistic, but definitely there are a lot more shades of gray in play there.
Yeah, I mean, because The Shadow, not to get too off topic, but The Shadow is the character that, you know, because of his popularity on the radio and the involvement of guys like Orson Welles, The Shadow is the guy that predated and had a huge influence on, you know, Bob Kane and Bill Finger in the creation of Batman.
Yep.
So, you know, The Shadow's more of that, where, you know, The Rocketeer is much more of the vibe that you get in Captain America: The First Avenger. And so, yes, there's this earnestness, there's this, you know, Boy Scoutness. There's the scene at the end of The First Avenger where, you know, Red Skull kind of sneeringly looks at Captain America and says, you know, "You Americans, what makes you think you're so special?" And he says, "Nothing. I'm just a guy from Brooklyn."
Yeah. Yeah. Man, there's so much. Everything that he says in that whole movie is just so inspiring. And I think that's really the genius of that movie, is that it was able to be just unflinchingly patriotic and positive without descending into jingoism. And it's such a wonderful film, and it makes me a little bit embarrassed that I was ever skeptical of the casting of Chris Evans as Captain America.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why somebody might be, considering that previously, you know, he played Johnny Storm.
Right, yeah. I mean, because you look at his body of work before that, and you're like, this guy's got zero gravitas. How is he possibly going to pull off Steve Rogers?
Right. And then he did.
And who could play him now? Who other than Chris Evans is ever going to be Captain America to the extent that he is? You know, you can barely even imagine it.
Well, I'm sympathetic to that, but I think that, you know, depending on how long the MCU goes, you're going to have to eventually imagine somebody like Bucky or Sam.
Well, and see, here's the really interesting thing. At the end of Civil War, I was 100% prepared for Steve Rogers to die in Civil War.
Fair enough.
Because obviously that's how it goes in the comics, and I was pretty sure that his contract was just about up also. And also I knew that Stan Sebastian had signed a 9-picture deal with Marvel.
Yes.
So and that whole thing when you know, in the comics when Cap was spoilers for a 12-year-old comic book series. When Cap was assassinated on the steps of the Capitol building as he was giving up at the end of Civil War, and Bucky took over, I thought that was a really interesting sort of commentary on who Captain America is and what he means and where we are as a nation now, as opposed to where we were when Captain America sort of first came on the scene. And the sort of idea that it is fitting for someone who feels, you know, maybe a little bit unworthy of the mantle of Captain America, and maybe who doesn't even necessarily believe in all of the ideals of Captain America, nevertheless still trying to somehow uphold those ideals and live up to that standard.
Right.
Yeah, I just thought that was an interesting way to go in the comics. And honestly, I kind of hope